Welcome to our study in the book of Psalms. In this lesson, we will take a look at the prayer psalms. These passages are written through the lens of experience and emotion. Whatever we experience on any given day, we can be sure that there is a prayer psalm to resonate with our emotions and feelings. Think of it this way. It's as if our emotions are a wilderness, and the psalmists are showing us a faithful way through the terrain. They write out of joy at times, and other times out of deep sorrow or frustration. When the emotions are not positive, we must read to the end of the psalm and observe what the writer does to deal with the emotional turmoil. Psalms are meant to be read as a whole, so we are able to see the author's entire journey. Psalm 4 is a great example of a prayer psalm. Here, David expresses his trust in the Lord. Answer me when I call, O God, of my righteousness. You have relieved me in my distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception? Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Tremble and do not sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. Selah. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and trust in the Lord. Many are saying, who will show us any good? Lift up the light of your countenance upon us, O Lord. You have put gladness in my heart, more than when their grain and new wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell in safety. David cries out in faithfulness and claims that the Lord has relieved him of his distress. Through these words, David explains that God uses our distress to help us grow and to help us know, love, worship, and serve Him more fully. Stress is something I'm sure we have all been familiar with at some point in our lives. Stress is the emotional strain caused by adverse circumstances or tense emotional pressure from a demanding environment. Frankly, David seems a little stressed in this psalm, and he is unable to sleep from his anxiety. If we are full of stress or anxiety, Psalm 4 is very relatable. When David writes, he talks to God about himself. As David prays, God is faithful to speak to him. God reveals himself to David, and we read that David is able to reach some conclusions in the middle of the night. Remember that prayer is a conversation with God and has two dimensions. The first dimension is when we are talking to God. This aspect is vital, as God desires to hear from us. The second dimension is when God is speaking to us. In several prayer psalms, the psalmist says something to God, and then God responds to the psalmist. In this psalm, David is uptight and tells God about it. God is faithful to respond and to reveal himself to David. Even one answered prayer should change us. If we cry out to God and He answers, it means that God is interested in us and our problems. What a miraculous thing to consider that the Creator of the universe cares about each one of us enough to listen and respond. Once we have experienced this reality, we should never be the same again. This kind of experience should humble us and leave us in awe of our good God. As God continues to speak, David meditates and finds a calming sense of trust. God is showing us the importance of our own self-talk. Sometimes we need to have a little meeting within our own mind. We need to slow down and acknowledge the truth instead of letting the lies take over. David has apparently been distressed because he has some upcoming decisions to make that involve doing some righteous but hard things. As you may have experienced in your own life, the right things are seldom easy. This is what Jesus means when in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 14, he describes the right path for life as a narrow gate that only a few can enter. As David continues listening to God, he knows what he must do. He will offer the sacrifices of righteousness, and he will trust in God. Many people are counting on him to do good, and there is no way he can make the right kinds of sacrifices in life without wholeheartedly relying on God. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6 says it well. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who seek Him. God tells us that whatever sacrifices we have to make in order to do the right things, we must do with the motive of faithfulness. We must resolve in our hearts that we are going to make these sacrifices for the sake of righteousness. And we must leave the outcomes to God. We know that we can trust Him and that He will be faithful. It is no secret that the human heart can be selfish, lazy, and pleasure-driven. Our world is characterized by self-centeredness, lies, murder, betrayal, and many other forms of darkness. David describes this problem in Psalm 14. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one. We see that things were no better in Paul's day when he quotes this psalm in Romans 3. He is describing the shared corruption of both the Jews and the Gentiles. And as I am sure you recognize, things are no better today. The human heart on its own is full of sinful desires. We are indeed people who need a merciful God who is capable of transforming us and making us new. Without continual confrontation and conviction from the Word, Proverbs 18:19 says, "The people are unrestrained, but happy is he who keeps the law." Jesus says in Matthew 6:33, "Seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." Seeking first His kingdom and His righteousness will direct us to make right choices and to live as people who reflect the heart of God. When David resolves to do this, he experiences emotional transformation. He is washed in peace, gladness, and security. David knows that he must make the righteous choice, and he trusts to leave the rest with God. He knows that God is the only true source of security. Psalm 55 is another great example of an emotional prayer psalm. Listen to the words of David in verses 1 through 6. "Give ear to my prayer, O God, and do not hide yourself from my supplication. Give heed to me and answer me. I am restless in my complaint, and I must moan because of the voice of the enemy, because of the pressure of the wicked. For they bring down trouble upon me, and in anger they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. I said, Oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest." As you hear these words, you can really sense David's agony. He cries out to the Lord for help. It's believed that David wrote Psalm 55 after he receives word that Ahithophel, his trusted counselor, has advised his beloved son Absalom to rape several of David's wives. Ahithophel does this on the rooftop of the palace in plain view of the people to try and provoke David into battle before David is really ready for the fight. The cruel act is also to reveal the people's commitment to either David or Absalom. Ahithophel's goal does seem to include an aspect of revenge too. As it turns out, Ahithophel is the grandfather of Bathsheba, the woman David himself raped. David explains his difficult situation in verses 12 through 15. "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion and my familiar friend. We, who had sweet fellowship together, walked in the house of God in the throng. Let death come deceitfully upon them. Let them go down alive to Sheol, for evil is in their dwelling, in their midst." We might assume that David is always calm and still, as he is the writer of the famous Psalm 23 about the great shepherd. While this is not the case, in Psalm 55, he is obviously struck by grief. He cries out in anguish, and he is distracted. At one point in life, when David rejects God's leading and becomes comfortable and arrogant, he commits the sins of adultery and murder. Then he even attempts to cover up his crimes. Now, several years later, David is paying the consequences of his sins. His wives are also suffering the consequences, as well as many others he hurt along the way. This is just as the prophet Nathan predicted in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 11 through 12. "Behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. Indeed, You did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and under the sun." David's heart is miserable. David's first reaction to this horrific grief is to escape. He wants to run away. He writes that if only he had wings, he would be able to disappear into the wilderness. Then we read the word Selah. This means that the song pauses here for a few beats, giving the audience a chance to reflect on what has just been said. For many people, their first response to a crisis is to escape, especially if shame is a part of the story. It is only human nature for us to want to run from tragic circumstances that cause us harm, and when we can't physically run away, we often try to distract ourselves from our true feelings by using chemical or emotional distractions. We must resist this temptation. Unless we're being physically threatened, escape is rarely God's plan for us, especially when we are experiencing the consequences of our own sinful actions. Now, David is more troubled by the fact that some of his friends and family have become enemies than he is by the thought of battle. When a close friend betrays you, this may be one of the worst emotional injuries you can suffer. David is experiencing the same pain of betrayal that he caused others years before, when he raped Bathsheba and murdered her husband Uriah to cover up his actions. David is now living the hurt he once caused others. After some time of grieving, David gets over the impulse to flee and decides to call upon the Lord, who has been nothing but faithful to him. He never doubts the salvation of the Lord. He says in Psalm 55:16, "As for me, I shall call upon God, and the Lord will save me." He has unwavering assurance that God will deliver him. We all have our burdens, perhaps in times of war, in times of national disaster, while experiencing the death of loved ones, or in other personal tragedies. At some point, it is inevitable that we will experience the kinds of emotions David speaks about in Psalm 55. Maybe we experience them innocently, and maybe sometimes we, like David, share some responsibility for them. When this time of pain comes, and you are overwhelmed with fear, turn to Psalm 55 and let David's inspired words guide and sustain you. As we close, let us remember this. When we are stressed and cannot sleep from the heaviness of life, let Psalm 4 show us the way out of that emotional wilderness. When we face tragic circumstances, whether we are responsible for them or not, we can find emotional guidance from King David in Psalm 55. David understands that God is faithful to deliver. We must be confident in this same truth. As the Apostle Peter says in 1 Peter 5:6-7, "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you."